So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 25. It's titled The Crisis Deepens, World War II. And so if you remember previously, last week we were talking about kind of the interim period between the world wars. And we talked about a lot of the communist revolutions, a lot of the political and economic turmoil, and in general kind of setting the stage for why the First World War wasn't the war to end all wars like so many hoped. In fact, you could just say it was the beginning of the Second 100 Years' War, unfortunately. So first off, we're looking at a picture of Adolf Hitler, and he's saluting military leaders and soldiers during a military rally. The Nazis were famous for having these large public spectacles, typically in a town called Nuremberg, and they were called the Nuremberg rallies. And these large spectacles were a bit of a hallmark back to the ancient Romans with the games in the Colosseum and the bread and circus that was such a big part of Roman culture and was really the emperor's way of buying the affection of the people. And so, first we should begin by talking about the totalitarian state. What does totalitarian actually mean? Now, first, totalitarian means a government which has complete or total control over its citizens' lives. Now, the rise of these types of regimes in the 1930s had a great deal to do with the beginning of the Second World War. In fact, democracy in Western Europe was a rarity by 1930. There were only two major states left in Europe that could be described as democracies. There was France and Great Britain. And because of what we discussed last week, most other European nations had turned to either communism or a political movement called Fascism, which is Latin, meaning a strong bundle of cords. Fascism became popular in Italy and in Germany. And you could argue that it was a reaction to the rising communist movements. The middle class within Germany and Italy did not want to see their countries go completely to the left, and so they reacted by going to the opposite extreme, to the right, by giving up their freedoms to ensure economic stability. In fact, most European states had adopted some type of authoritarian structure. And of course, meanwhile, Japan was undergoing a process towards militarization. Now, these dictatorships assumed some old forms. Now, dictatorship's not necessarily a new form. You know, absolute rule has been around since the beginnings of civilization. However, the modern totalitarian state is a relatively new phenomenon. The best examples of this are Russia under Joseph Stalin, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. And what does this mean? Well, number one, we can shorten this and call them total states, meaning the state had total control over its people, expecting complete loyalty and commitment of their citizens, unconditionally. Whether that goal be war, whether that goal be the foundation of a socialist society, or in the case of Germany, a 1,000-year empire, in what they called the Third Reich. Now, how did these nations pull this off? And that was always a question I had in studying the Nazis. How on earth Did people just buy into what this nutcase was telling them? One important tool that totalitarian states used, and really our country is notorious for this as well, is propaganda. And we've talked about propaganda several times through. Modern forms of this include high-speed communication through radio, and of course through mass printing, newspapers, magazines, etc., to win the hearts of their subjects. And what was the goal of this total state control? Well, number one, it was not only the economic control of the state, or the political, or even social, but the goal was the complete intellectual and cultural control. Meaning that Germany wanted to define for its people what it means to be German. That's why Germany was called the fatherland. It was seen as a true parent to its people. Now, totalitarianism works best with a single leader led by a single party. Now, this requires a complete rejection of any form of constitutional freedoms, any form of limited government. It means the total control. And it requires the creation of a society where the citizens of that society make their own persons, their own individuality, subordinate to the collective will of the masses. Perhaps Spock on Star Trek said it best, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's how one has to think in one of these societies. And that collective will would be determined for them by their leader. Now, thanks to modern technology, these states have the ability to actually enforce their wishes upon their subjects, thanks to mass communication, thanks to efficient political organization, thanks to ruthless enforcement of their laws. So the first case study I want to give you on the birth of fascism is Benito Mussolini. Now, in the early 1920s, Benito Mussolini bestowed on Italy the first successful fascist movement in all throughout Europe. Now, how did he do it? Well, first off, he had been a veteran of the First World War, and during that time, he had established a political group called the League of Combat. And this group became very popular, particularly by the urban middle class within Italy. And he was able to play on middle class workers' fear of communism, fear of socialism, fear of economic upheaval. And so, in order to protect their wealth and property, in order to protect their country's economic stability, people turned to Mussolini. And by October 29th of 1922, Mussolini and the fascists threatened to take power if it were not given to them. In a bit of a historic move, they threatened to march on Rome, just like Julius Caesar had by crossing the Rubicon. And Mussolini had hopes to rebuild the glory of the former Roman Empire. And he had the people behind him, too. In fact, the king of Italy at this time was named Victor Emmanuel. And he was forced to capitulate, meaning to step down, and forced to recognize Mussolini as El Duce, the head of the fascist state. And so by 1926, Mussolini had formed a fascist dictatorship which gave him power to legislate by decree, meaning he had the ability to make any law he wanted without having to consult anyone else. He had the ability to repress any opposition. The police had the right to arrest anyone, to confine anyone without pressing charges. They simply had to suspect them of disloyalty. The government was given the power to dissolve any organization that they wished. They could shut down any church, they could close any school, they could shut down any club that they wanted to. And they didn't even have to give the reason. In fact, in 1926, any political parties which resisted or spoke against fascism were outlawed, and a secret police had been established. Now, Mussolini believed that his fascist state was totalitarian, meaning he believed, or he sought for, total control of his people. And he tried to create this police state in which the police had complete control over the people, this idea of totalitarianism that I just discussed, where the lives of all their citizens were subordinate to the collective will. Mussolini was never quite effective at pulling this off. However, even though Italy never fully united under fascism, and it was the first of these regimes to fall, he did attempt to exercise control over all forms of mass media, all newspapers, all radio, all movies were instruments to sell the idea of fascism to the people. For example, one common slogan in Italy was "Mussolini is always right." It was plastered on the walls of Rome, on the streets, everywhere, all over Italy. Mussolini is always right. Now, where do women fit into this? In fact, in most of these, all three of these fascist societies that we're going to discuss, Germany, Italy, and Japan, women into the home was the fascist slogan. Women were seen as homemakers and producers of children, that their fundamental mission in life was to provide population growth. And so it was seen as a woman's duty to actually have as many children as she could, so that they could grow up to be good soldiers. So, as a result, employment in Italy for women outside the home was highly discouraged. And I'll quote Mussolini himself from your book. And I quote, "It forms an independence and consequent physical and moral habits contrary to childbearing." So the idea, again, was that women should be these baby-making factories, if you will. Now, despite, again, Italy was never as successful at fascism as Germany or even Russia was. Mussolini never achieved the degree of control of these other places. And this is why we're going to move on and discuss other more powerful fascist movements in the North. And this, of course, brings us to Hitler and Nazi Germany. Now, in 1923, Adolf Hitler attempted to seize control in Germany. He was the head of a small and really obscure, far to the right political party. And when he failed to take power, though it landed him in prison, it made national news. And this failed coup actually won quite a bit of support for Adolf Hitler. Now, he had been a veteran of the First World War, served for 4 years on the Western Front, and then after the war was over, he joined the German Workers' Party. And this was one of really a number of extreme nationalistic parties based out of Munich, Germany. And by 1921, Hitler had assumed control of the party. And he named it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, called the Nazi Party for short. Within 2 years of 1921, the party's membership had reached 55,000 strong. There were 15,000 within the party's militia. They were called the Stormtroops. And so Hitler decided to stage another uprising against the government in November of 1923. And Hitler was sent to prison. Now, while he was in jail, he wrote an autobiographical account of his life growing up and in the military. And he laid out his ideology. The book's called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. It describes an extreme German nationalism. He believed that the Aryan race was destined to rule the world. He believed they were a superior race, and that history had shown that to be true. He blamed the Jewish people for Germany's failure in the First World War. He claimed there was a Jewish conspiracy to work against the German people. Anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe, dating back to the times of the Roman Empire. They were a common scapegoat. The Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague. The Jews were blamed for economic troubles. The Jews were blamed for all manner of things. And so blaming them for the failure of the First World War gave the German people a common enemy. As we've talked about before, sadly, often it takes a common enemy to bring people together. And in this case, it was the Jews. Now also in Mein Kampf, he laid out the idea based on Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, that superior nations had a right to Lebensraum, which is living space, and that they had the right to take this land from lesser peoples through aggressive expansion. Now, what was Hitler's goal? You wonder, what if the Nazis had taken over the world? What did he actually want to do? And he promised, he believed that if he won, he could create a Germany free of class differences and united in a common goal. Now, during his imprisonment, Hitler came to the realization that the Nazis would have to come to power by political means. That they just weren't going to be successful in overthrowing the Weimar Republic, which was the government which had been established by the Treaty of Versailles. So by 1929, the Nazis had risen to a fully national party. And so, within 3 years, the Nazi Party had grown from a mere 55,000 members to 800,000. They were the largest political party in Germany. Now, how did the Nazis rise to this great power? You can't just lay it on Hitler's charisma. For one, there were a lot of economic troubles. Unemployment had rose from 4 million to 6 million within a year. Germany was going through a number of economic difficulties. For example, in the Treaty of Versailles, they had been forced to pay reparations totaling $33 billion, which at that time was enough to cripple an economy. That's as much as America spent on the entire New Deal, pulling us out of the Great Depression. But as I said before, Hitler was a charismatic speaker. One school teacher said, and I quote, after listening to a speech of his, when the speech was over, there was roaring enthusiasm and applause. How many look up to him with touching faith as their savior, their deliverer from unbearable distress? Hitler was promising these people greatness, and they were in the midst of a depression. He was promising to make Germany great again. And people bought it. Now, how about the wealthy in Germany? Because we talk all the time about the power of the 1%. Well, the elites in Germany wanted an authoritarian regime. And I'm talking about, be it the industrial corporate executives, the old money, the landed aristocrats, the military powers that be, or even the higher-ranking government officials. All these people came to see Hitler as the man who had the support to establish and unite the people under an authoritarian regime that would save Germany from communism. In a time of crisis, democracy is sorely tested. Because if we found ourselves in a survival situation, sitting and discussing and voting on what to do is not going to work. Eventually we will turn to the most experienced of us, and we will follow that person, and we will do what that person tells us to do until we begin to doubt them. And then we will find somebody better. That's an authoritarian structure in a crisis situation. And that's a natural human response, is to look for a strong person to fix our problems for us. That's what the wealthy wanted, and that's what the poor were turning to. Hitler became the chancellor on January 30th of 1933. The Nazi power had the lion's share of the German government, and Hitler became chancellor of this new government with the Enabling Act on March 23rd of 1933. With 2/3 of a vote in the German Reichstag, which is the equivalent of our Congress, the German people voted for an emergency dictatorship. This is in fact an old practice, dating back to the times of the Roman Empire, that even the Romans recognized that in a time of crisis, An executive has to rise to power with near godlike authority to fix the problems in the country, with the understanding that that same person will step down from these emergency powers once the crisis has abated. Imagine, if you will, the power that Abraham Lincoln assumed during the Civil War. He became perhaps the most important and powerful person that has ever lived in this country. Why? We were in the midst of a great crisis. And in the midst of a great crisis, the German people turned to this person and appointed him Fuhrer. And so the Nazis began to move to bring all institutions under their control. Remember, National Socialism united the German people in a hatred against the Jews, bringing a common enemy to unify their people. And so this meant that Jews were almost immediately removed from any government positions. Almost immediately, concentration camps were established. Trade unions were dissolved. And any opposition to the Nazi Party was abolished. In fact, by the end of the summer of 1933, the Nazis had a totalitarian state. So let's discuss this Nazi state. So Hitler now felt that the real task was to develop the total state. His goal was an Aryan racial state which would dominate all of Europe for many, many years. And to quote Hitler himself, and I quote, "We must develop organizations in which an individual's entire life can take place. Then every activity and every need of every individual will be regulated by the collectivity represented by the party. There is no longer any arbitrary will. There are no longer any free realms in which the individual belongs to himself. The time of personal happiness is over." Scary stuff, folks. What he's saying is the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. It's time for us to put aside our individuality and commit ourselves to the state, is what he was telling the German people. And this is totalitarianism. This is what the United States fought against. Now, how do you sell such a notion to a formerly free people? You know, in America, we're raised to be individuals. Everything in our education teaches us to think independently. That's the idea, is we're supposed to learn to think independently. That's why we do so much writing in here. It's why, you know, throughout school you've been told to get up and talk and discuss, deliberate, etc. Those are all elements of democracy. How do you convert people away from that? And so one thing they did was mass demonstrations and spectacles. The idea was to bring the German nation into a collective fellowship as an instrument for Hitler's policies. They had almost a religious symbolism to them. They were meant to be fun events, at times solemn, but they were primarily gimmicks. Because the idea was that the government would maintain absolute control and order in theory. But actually, in practice, Germany was in a state of almost constant conflict. It was a very chaotic country. Even though on the outside it looked like this very united totalitarian state. Yet, though this place was chaotic, Hitler did manage to remain the sole decision maker and absolute ruler. Now, in the economic sphere, the Nazis worked to establish complete control. National Socialism is different. It's two completely different systems than the socialism you're hearing in the news. That's democratic socialism. This is National Socialism. So, National Socialism does involve the complete government takeover of the means of production. And in doing so, Germany was able to drop unemployment to almost nothing by 1937. And many people were willing to trade their freedom for this, for the economic growth. And so many Germans accepted the new regime despite the loss of freedom, simply because in their eyes, well, it got the economy working. You know, one of the common phrases that Italians used of Mussolini was, well, at least the trains ran on time under this guy, because he would shoot the conductor if they didn't. Now, the Nazi state, again, and by no means apologizing for this at all. I think it's terrifying to think about. And the SS are a great example. Heinrich Himmler, head of the German SS, came to be the German secret police. They operated on two basic principles: terror and ideology. Meaning that as secret police, they would murder or execute anyone who was against the German state. And they also existed for the purpose of the extermination of the Jews. Himmler was a firm believer in this concept of a racial state. And he was a firm believer that the Aryan race was, and I quote, the master race. Now, like in Italy, women also played an important role. To the Nazis, the women were to be wives and mothers, and the men were destined to be warriors. By 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were put into place. These new racial laws would exclude German Jews from citizenship, from marriage, even from relationships with non-Jews. Now, perhaps the first, or at least most famous case of the beginning of the violence was known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. And this was the beginning of the rounding up of the Jewish people. 7,000 Jewish businesses were burned. At least 100 Jews were killed on this one night alone. And after this, Jews were banned from, or prohibited from, owning or working in any private retail store. Your book also includes this picture. This is a great classic example of the Nazi mass spectacle. Hitler and the Nazis made clever use of mass spectacles to rally the German people behind the Nazi regime. These mass demonstrations evoked intense enthusiasm, as is evident in this photograph of Hitler arriving at the Buckel Bark near Hamelin for the Harvest Festival in 1937. 1 million people were present at this particular celebration. The next totalitarian regime we need to discuss is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union began in 1917. after the Bolshevik Revolution and what we discussed last week, Vladimir Lenin rose to power. He launched his first 5-year plan, and after Lenin and his death, Joseph Stalin rose to power. And he launched his first 5-year plan in 1928. And the goal was the transformation of the Soviet Union from a backwards, agrarian, pre-industrial state to a modern, post-industrial, collectivist society. Its real goal was to do this virtually overnight. Instead of consumer goods, the plan emphasized the maximum production of capital goods and armaments and quadrupled the production of heavy machinery, doubling the production of oil. And during this first and second 5-year plan, steel production grew from 4 million tons a year up to 18 million tons a year. Another goal of this movement was the collectivization of agriculture. You see, communism means that all means of production are owned by the state and then distributed by the state to the people. Now, rapid industrialization was also accompanied by rapid collectivization of agriculture. So the idea here was to eliminate private farms operating for profit and anyone who resisted. For example, there were a number of peasants who would either hoard their crops or kill their livestock to prevent them from being collected by the state officials. And this caused Stalin to step up his program. For example, by 1934, the process of collecting all agricultural products had created a famine which caused the deaths of 10 million peasants. 10 million Russian peasants died in the process of forming state-controlled farms. Now you can imagine that this made Stalin a rather unpopular person, which is why he also instituted the Great Purges. Anyone who resisted, publicly or privately, would be sent to forced labor camps in Siberia, which has an Arctic climate, which for most is a death sentence. Stalin sought sole control of decision-making, just like Mussolini and Hitler. And so because of this, he had to get rid of anyone who might disagree with him. And his most prominent opponents were the old Bolsheviks, the people who had started the communist revolution. He had them put to death outright. He undertook a purge of military officers, diplomats, union officials, party members, intellectuals, and countless ordinary citizens. Some believe that as many as 8 million Russians were arrested, and we have really no idea of how many of these died in forced labor camps, this making Stalin the largest mass murderer in history. Much of the communist legislation of the 1920s was reversed under Joseph Stalin. When Stalin came to power, abortion was outlawed, Divorced fathers who failed to support their children were fined heavily. This in contrast to previous, where abortion was easy to obtain, divorce was easy to obtain, women and men essentially had equal rights, and much of that was overturned. And now to talk about militarism in Japan. So Japan was also in the process of militarizing. And they had this concept of Asia for the Asians. Japan had been in a constant state of warfare and military production really since the end of the 1800s. The Great Depression was a worldwide depression, not just one here in the United States. It had had a disastrous effect on Japan. The United States had set up high tariffs or taxes on imports. And so Japan had nowhere to trade their goods with. And this placed a heavy burden on the fragile economy of Japan. And as we know, in times of crisis, people turn to authoritarian regimes. If you're getting shot at, you don't sit down and discuss with your friends what should be done. You listen to the person that says, "Come with me if you want to live." And that's what was happening here with the Japanese. And so these extremist political organizations began by assassinating key businessmen or public figures identified with friendliness to the outside world. And this message of Asia for the Asians became extremely popular. Another one of these "Let's make Japan great" slogans. So through the 1930s, the military wing of the Japanese government began to take steadily increased control. There still continued to be democratic national elections, but the cabinets of these elected leaders were dominated by the Japanese military, who had the goal of expansion. If the United States would not allow Japan to sell their excess consumer goods, they would conquer new lands to have an opportunity to sell their goods, to gain a source of raw materials, just like the United States when we discussed imperialism and the Philippines. Now, in 1936, a group of military officers led a coup, trying to take over the government altogether. These people were found of treason, but nonetheless, the military continued to grow in its influence. Only 20 years after the First World War, the world was moving towards war once more. The efforts at collective security had proved meaningless. The collective security of the Treaty of Versailles and breaking up Germany and placing all these rules and restrictions against them had proved ineffective. To Hitler, Germany needed more land to support a larger population to become a great power. And so he repudiated the Treaty of Versailles in 1935. Now, in doing so, this could have been grounds for war, because the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty under which Germany surrendered to Britain and France. In fact, Germany wasn't supposed to have a military. Over 100,000 soldiers. Hitler increased this to 550,000 in March of 1935. There was no concrete reaction from either Britain or France. Meanwhile, Hitler and Mussolini signed the Rome-Berlin Axis, agreeing to cooperate and to work together in their mutual goals of expansion. By 1937, Germany was once more a world power and was on its way to annexing Austria. And his next step was the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler claimed that there were 3 million German people living there, and that they were being abused by the people of Czechoslovakia, and that he hoped to liberate them. So let's review. At this point, Hitler has quintupled the size of his army. He wasn't supposed to do that. He's announced a military alliance with Italy. Wasn't supposed to do that. He has annexed Austria. Again, not supposed to do that. And each time Britain and France have said, you better not do that again, you better not do that again, don't do that again. And now, he's threatening to annex a part of Czechoslovakia, and the Czechoslovakians are saying no. And at this point, Britain and France are growing very concerned, because they're running out of opportunities to say, you better not do that again, or, because you can only say that so many times without backing it up. And so the Munich Conference was held in October of 1938. And Hitler promised the prime ministers of Britain and France that this would be his last territorial demand. And so they signed the Munich Agreement, and Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. And then in August of 1939, and really, Britain and France, in fact, Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain returned and announced on the radio, peace in our time. And everyone was like, okay, maybe that's it. It's kind of like what's going on with Russia. People are like, there's no way that Russia's going to go further than Crimea. Okay, there's no way he's going to go further than Syria. It's whatever. It's not going to happen because it's going to create all these problems. And at this time here, okay, he took Austria. There's no way he's going to go any further because this is going to create a world war. Surely he has to know better than this. And really, what a lot of people were hoping for is that he knew better than to expand west, because that brings him into war with Britain, France, and then that's bad. And he knows better than to expand east, because, well, that's going to bring him to war with Russia, and we all know that's bad. And if he goes to war with Russia, then he goes to war with Britain and France, and then, there's no way. It's just not going to work. And so most people were like, it's just not going to happen. And then Hitler announces a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in August of 1939. It was called the Warsaw Pact because they agreed to split Poland between them. And so the German troops invaded Poland from the west, and the Soviet soldiers invaded Poland from the east on September 1st of 1939, and thus the Second World War began. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Japanese had maintained a strong military and economic presence in Manchuria following the Russo-Japanese War. However, the Japanese plan was to completely take over China, to expand from Manchuria into northern China. The leader of China at this time was named Chiang Kai-shek, and he hoped to avoid direct confrontation with Japan so that he could deal with the communists, who he really considered the greater threat because, in fact, after the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek's regime will fall to the communists led under Mao Zedong. China is still a communist nation today. But as Japan moved steadily southward from Manchuria and claimed victory after victory, and Japan finally went to war with China in 1937, they became the new order in the East. Now, why did Japan begin this? And again, I have to ask the question, why did they attack the United States at Pearl Harbor? In fact, I got the chance to sit and have lunch with an American naval sub-captain yesterday, and I asked him the same question. I'm like, so, why Pearl Harbor? I know it from the textbook, but I had to know it from somebody who was actually like a captain. And, he was like, well, had Japan knocked out those aircraft carriers, America probably would have lost the Battle of Midway, and Japan could have knocked the United States out of the war, and things might have gone a lot differently. It's weird, like one of those what ifs. We had our entire Western Pacific carrier fleet in Pearl Harbor, and shortly before Pearl Harbor, we dispatched them on patrol, on exercises. So anyway, but why? Why did Japan begin this expansionist policy? Now, throughout the late 1930s, Japan was cooperating with the Nazis on the assumption that the two countries would ultimately launch an attack on the Soviet Union, dividing their resources between them. But then, of course, when Hitler announced this non-aggression pact with the Soviets, the Japanese realized they weren't strong enough to fight the Soviets on their own, but they needed the resources that the Russians had. Particularly, there are massive stores of oil in the Ural Mountains of Russia. And a modern war needs oil to function. And so Japan realized their next best option was to conquer the Southeast Asia. The Dutch East Indies have oil reserves. Malaya has large stores of rubber. Burma and Indochina are large rice-producing countries, and so these resources would be vital to the Japanese war effort. Now, Japan's attack on China was highly controversial. In fact, 20 million Chinese people died at the hands of the Japanese, so this definitely made them the bad guys in many eyes. And Japan was constantly playing a diplomatic game with the Americans because they badly needed trading relations with the United States. They needed American oil and scrap iron. And if the United States cut them off from these, they would have to conquer more countries to take them. And so, in order to continue to advance their objectives, they had to risk being cut off from the resources they needed to continue the conflict. This is why Japan eventually decided to launch an attack on American and European colonies in Southeast Asia and hoped to push the United States out of the region entirely. And so this photograph is showing a Japanese victory in China. And after consolidating their authority over Manchuria, the Japanese began to expand into northern China. Direct hostilities between Japanese and Chinese forces began in 1937. This photograph shows victorious Japanese forces riding under the arched Chungsong Gate in Nanjing in January of 1938, after they had conquered the Chinese capital. By 1939, Japan had conquered most of eastern China. And now on to Europe at war. So, the Germans had developed a new tactic called the Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War, very similar to the shock and awe strategy the United States used against Iraq in our most recent war. And it was speed and efficiency. Armored columns of panzer tanks, supported by airplanes, were able to quickly dominate and break the Polish lines. And then infantry comes in to sweep up the mess. In using this tactic, Germany conquered Poland in 4 weeks. Next step was Scandinavia in April of 1940. Using the Blitzkrieg against Denmark and Norway, and within a month, the Netherlands, Belgium, and then France. Now, the French had just finished a 4-year-long war with the Germans where they halted the German advances time and time again using trench warfare. And in the meantime, between the world wars, the French had been preparing for another one, fortifying these entrenchments, arming them against a future invasion. And they had built a series of forts called the Maginot Line, which still stand today. Hitler famously went around them through the Ardennes forest in 1940. And on the other side of the Ardennes forest, there were very weak French defenses. The French and the British army stationed there were forced to retreat, and 330,000 French and British Allied soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, awaiting escape as the Nazis were coming. And by a heroic effort, fishing boats, commercial vessels, military ships, anything that would float was engaged in this rescue effort of getting 330,000 men across the Atlantic to Great Britain. And from there, the French government set up an exile out of Great Britain. Next step was the Battle of Britain. Hitler had now conquered all of Western Europe within a span of a few years. And Britain stood alone. Now, being an island nation is what saved this country, because before the German Navy could land troops, they needed air superiority. And so for 6 months, the German Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, flew bombing raids day after day after day, over and over, bombing the German cities, bombing the British cities, attacking the British air defenses day after night for 6 months. And the British held on. And they never fully gained control of the air. And so Hitler had to call off the Battle of Britain to free up resources for Operation Barbarossa, which was a full-scale invasion of Russia. Because like Japan, Hitler realized he needed Russian resources. And that being unable to conquer Britain meant that he would have to get these resources from Russia. And this is the largest land invasion in history. It began in June of 1941 and proved to be the turning point of the Second World War, which we'll discuss. In a bit. Now, meanwhile, Japan at war. Japan's offensive in the Pacific and Southeast Asia led them to the conclusion that they would have to go to war with the United States. And so, as I said before, the goal of the Japanese Navy was to cripple the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. It was a decisive Japanese victory against a key American military base. But perhaps our saving grace was that our carrier fleet was not stationed there at the time, though many ships were. And second only to 9/11, this was the worst attack on American soil in our history. Now, Japan declared the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and this meant that the entire region would be under Japanese tutelage. And they intended to liberate any colonies in Southeast Asia from Western rule. Japanese leaders hoped that their lightning strikes of American bases would destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet and force the President of the United States to accept Japanese domination of the Pacific. But in fact, this Japanese attack polarized American support for the war. And so, as the war was turning against the Axis powers in the years of 1942 and 43, one of the pivotal moments was the entry of the United States because of this Japanese attack. The United States formed a coalition called the Grand Alliance, or the Allies for short, and were successful in defeating the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. However, in 1942, the Axis powers were far from defeat. They have at this point conquered nearly half the world between them. Japanese forces continued to advance in the Pacific, had been undefeated. And until 1942, it still seemed that the Germans might actually defeat Russia. Erwin Rommel had been winning in North Africa against the British Army there. The Germans had succeeded in conquering most of Eastern Europe. But after the fall of 1942, the war began to turn against the Germans. And several key battles here proved to be the turning point of the war. For example, in North Africa, British forces managed to stop Rommel. In the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the deadliest battles in the history of warfare, perhaps the deadliest battle. Over a course of a year, 1.7 million Russians lost their lives defending this city. And they were eventually able to counterattack and trap 300,000 German soldiers. And the last battle I'll discuss today is the Battle of Coral Sea. And at this battle, the American naval forces stopped the Japanese advance of Australia, dealing the Japanese their first defeat. Now, the victory came at a high cost. 2/5 of the American planes were shot down in this encounter. But by this time, Allied forces were gathering for offensive operations, for liberation of the Philippines, and for an eventual island-hopping campaign which will lead to an end of the war in the Pacific. And I'll publish that so you can see the rest online. The last years of the war, the invasion of Italy in 1943. By the beginning of 1943, the tide of battle had turned against the German, Italy, and Japanese armies. After the Axis forces had surrendered in Tunisia on March 13th of 1943, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean and carried the war into Italy. After taking Sicily, Allied troops began the invasion of mainland Italy in September. In the meantime, after the ouster and arrest of Benito Mussolini, a new Italian government offered to surrender to the Allied forces. But Mussolini was liberated by the Germans in a daring raid, and then set up as the head of the puppet German state in northern Italy, while German troops moved in and occupied much of Italy. The new defensive lines established by the Germans in the hills south of Rome were so effective that the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula was a painstaking affair, accompanied by heavy casualties. Rome did not fall to the Allies until June 4th of 1944. By that time, the Italian War had assumed a secondary role anyway, as the Allies prepared to open their long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. Eisenhower and Normandy in 1944. Under the direction of the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies launched 5 assault divisions on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, in history's greatest naval invasion. An initially indecisive German response enabled the Allied forces to establish a beachhead. Within 3 months, they landed more than 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles that pushed inland and broke through German defense lines. The Battle of Kursk, 1943. After the breakout, Allied troops moved south and east and liberated Paris by the end of August. By March of 1945, they had crossed the Rhine River and advanced farther into Germany. At the end of April 1945, Allied armies in northern Germany moved toward the Elbe River, where they finally linked up with the Soviets. The Soviets had come a long way since the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943. In the summer of 1943, they soundly defeated German forces at the Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle of World War II. Soviet forces then began a relentless advance westward. The Soviets had reoccupied Ukraine by the end of 1943 and lifted the siege of Leningrad and moved into the Baltic states by the beginning of 1944. Advancing along a northern front, Soviet troops occupied Warsaw in January of 1945 and entered Berlin in April. Meanwhile, Soviet troops along the southern front swept through Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Hitler's suicide, April 30th, 1945. In January of 1945, Hitler had moved into a bunker 55 feet under Berlin to direct the final stages of the war. In his final political testament, Hitler, consistent to the end in his rabid anti-Semitism, blamed the Jews for the war. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 2 days after Mussolini had been shot by partisan Italian forces. German surrender, May 7th of 1945. On May 7th, German commanders surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Defeat of Japan, August 14th, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war in Asia continued. Beginning in 1943, American forces had gone on the offensive and proceeded, slowly at times, across the Pacific. The Americans took an increasing toll of enemy resources, especially at sea and in the air. As Allied military power drew inexorably closer to the main Japanese islands in the first months of 1945, President Harry Truman, who had succeeded to the presidency on the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April, had an excruciatingly difficult decision to make. Should he use atomic weapons? At the time, only 2 bombs had been developed, and their effectiveness had not been demonstrated to bring the war to an end without the necessity of an Allied invasion of the Japanese homeland. As the world knows, Truman answered that question in the affirmative. The first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6th. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally on August 14th. World War II was finally over. So this map shows World War II in Europe and North Africa. With its fast and effective military, Germany quickly overwhelmed much of Western Europe, Hitler overestimated his country's capabilities, however, and underestimated those of his opponents. By late 1942, his invasion of the Soviet Union was failing, and the United States had become a major factor in the war. The Allies successfully invaded Italy in 1943 and France in 1944. This map shows World War II in Asia and the Pacific. In 1937, Japan invaded northern China, beginning its effort to create a, quote, Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Further, Japanese expansion caused the United States to end iron and oil sales to Japan. Deciding that war with the United States was inevitable, Japan engineered a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This photograph is from the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point on the Eastern Front. Shown in the first photograph is a German infantry platoon in the ruins of a tractor factory they had captured in the northern part of Stalingrad. This victory took place on October 15th of 1942, at a time when Hitler still believed he was winning the battle for Stalingrad. That belief was soon dashed as a Soviet counteroffensive in November led to a total defeat for the Germans. This next photograph shows thousands of captured soldiers being marched across frozen Soviet soil to prison camps. The soldiers in white fur hats are Romanian. Fewer than 6,000 captured soldiers survived to go home. The remainder, almost 85,000 prisoners, died in captivity. This is just a quick chronology of the course of the Second World War, starting with Germany and the Soviet Union dividing Poland amongst them in September 28th of 1939 and going all the way down into the surrender of Japan, August 14th of 1945. The New Order. The initial victories of the Germans and the Japanese had given them the opportunity to create new orders in Europe and Asia. Both followed policies of ruthless domination of their subject peoples. The New Order in Europe, replacing Slavs with Germans. In 1942, the Nazi Empire stretched across continental Europe from the English Channel in the west to the outskirts of Moscow in the east. Nazi-occupied Europe was largely organized in one of two ways. Some areas, such as western Poland, were directly annexed by Nazi Germany and made into German provinces. The rest of occupied Europe was administered by German military or civilian officials in combination with different degrees of indirect control from collaborationist regimes. Because the conquered lands in the east contained the living space for German expansion and were populated in Nazi eyes by racially inferior Slavic peoples, Nazi administration there was considerably more ruthless than in the West. Soon after the conquest of Poland, Heinrich Himmler, a strong believer in Nazi racial ideology and the leader of the SS, was put in charge of German resettlement plans in the East. Himmler's task was to evaluate the inferior Slavic peoples and replace them with Germans, a policy first applied to the new German provinces created from the lands of Western Poland. 1 million Poles were uprooted and dumped in southern Poland. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans, descendants of Germans who had migrated years earlier from Germany to different parts of southern and eastern Europe, were encouraged to colonize designated areas in Poland. By 1942, 2 million ethnic Germans had been settled in Poland. Forced labor. Labor shortages in Germany led to a policy of ruthless mobilization of foreign labor for Germany. In 1942, a special office was created to recruit labor for German farms and industries. By the summer of 1944, 7 million foreign workers were laboring in Germany, constituting 20% of the labor force. At the same time, another 7 million workers were supplying forced labor in their own countries on farms, in industries, and even in military camps. The brutality of Germany's recruitment policies often led more and more people to resist the Nazi occupation forces. The Holocaust, the, quote, final solution to the Jewish problem. No aspect of the Nazi New Order was more terrifying than the deliberate attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Racial struggle was a key element in Hitler's ideology and meant to him a clearly defined conflict of opposites: the Aryans, creators of human cultural development, against the Jews, quote, parasites who were trying to destroy the Aryans. Himmler and the SS organization closely shared Hitler's racial ideology. The SS was given responsibility for what the Nazis called their final solution to the, quote, Jewish problem, the annihilation of the Jewish people. After the defeat of Poland, the SS ordered the Einsatzgruppen, or Special Strike Forces, to round up all Polish Jews and concentrate them in ghettos established in a number of Polish cities. In June 1941, the Einsatzgruppen were given new responsibilities as mobile killing units. These SS death squads followed the regular army's advance into Russia. Their job was to round up Jews in their villages and execute and bury them in mass graves, often giant pits dug by the victims themselves before they were shot. Such constant killing produced morale problems among the SS executioners. During a visit to Minsk in the Soviet Union, Hitler tried to build morale by pointing out that he, quote, would not like it if Germans did such a thing gladly, but their conscience was in no way impaired, for they were soldiers who had to carry out every order unconditionally. He alone had responsibility before God and Hitler for everything that was happening. Systemic annihilation in camps. Although it has been estimated that as many as 1 million Jews were killed by the Einsatzgruppen, this approach to solving the Jewish problem was soon perceived as inadequate. So the Nazis opted for the systematic annihilation of the European Jewish population in death camps. Jews from countries occupied by Germany or sympathetic to Germany were rounded up, packed like cattle into freight trains, and shipped to Poland, where 6 extermination centers were built for this purpose. The largest and most famous was Auschwitz at Birkenau. Medical technicians chose Zyklon B, the commercial name for hydrogen cyanide, as the most effective gas for quickly killing large numbers of people in gas chambers, designed to look like shower rooms to facilitate the cooperation of the victims. Auschwitz, Birkenau. The death camps were up and running by the spring of 1942. By the summer, Jews were also being shipped from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Even as the Allies were making significant advances in 1944, Jews were being shipped from Greece and Hungary. A harrowing experience awaited the Jews when they arrived at one of the 6 death camps. Rudolf Hess, commandant at Auschwitz-Birkenau, described it, quote, we had 2 SS doctors on duty at Auschwitz to examine the incoming transports of prisoners. The prisoners would be marched by one of the doctors who would make spot decisions as they walked by. Those who were fit for work were sent into the camp. Others were sent immediately to the extermination plants. Children of tender years were invariably exterminated, since by reason of their youth they were unable to work. At Auschwitz, we endeavored to fool the victims into thinking that they were to go through a delousing process. Of course, frequently, they realized our true intentions, and we sometimes had riots and difficulties due to that fact. About 30% of the arrivals at Auschwitz were sent to a labor camp. The remainder were sent to the gas chambers. After they had been gassed, the bodies were burned in specially built crematoria. The victims' goods and even their bodies were used for economic gain. Women's hair was cut off, collected, and used to stuff mattresses or make cloth. Although the Germans killed between 5 and 6 million Jews, more than 3 million of them in the death camps, about 90% of the Jewish populations of Poland and the Baltic countries and Germany were exterminated. Overall, the Holocaust was responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 of every 3 Jews in Europe. The Nazis were also responsible for another Holocaust, the death by shooting, starvation, or overwork of at least another 9 to 10 million people. Because the Nazis also considered the Gypsies of Europe, like the Jews, a race containing alien blood, they were systematically rounded up for extermination. About 40% of Europe's 1 million Gypsies were killed in the death camps. The leading elements of the, quote, subhuman Slavic species, the clergy, the intelligentsia, civil leaders, judges, and lawyers, were arrested and deliberately killed. Probably an additional 4 million Poles, Ukrainians, and Belarusians lost their lives as slave laborers for Nazi Germany, and 3 to 4 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed in captivity. The Nazis also singled out homosexuals for persecution, and thousands lost their lives in concentration camps. The New Order, puppet governments. Once the takeover was completed, Japanese war policy in the occupied areas in Asia became essentially defensive, as Japan hoped to use its new possessions to meet its burgeoning needs for raw materials, such as tin, oil, and rubber, and also as an outlet for Japanese manufactured goods. To provide an organizational structure for the arrangement, Japanese leaders set up the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a self-sufficient economic community designed to provide mutual benefits for the occupied areas and the home country. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia had been accomplished under the slogan, quote, Asia for the Asians. Japanese officials in the occupied territories quickly promised that independent governments would be established under Japanese tutelage. Such governments were eventually established in Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Vietnam, and the Philippines. In fact, however, real power rested with the Japanese military authorities in each territory, and the local Japanese military command was directly subordinated to the Army General Staff in Tokyo. The economic resources of the colonies were exploited for the benefit of the Japanese war machine, while the natives were recruited to serve in local military units or conscripted to work on public works projects. In some cases, the people living in the occupied areas were subjected to severe hardships. In Indochina, for example, forced requisitions of rice by the local Japanese authorities for shipment abroad created a food shortage that caused the starvation of more than 1 million Vietnamese in 1944 and 1945. Economic exploitation. At first, many Southeast Asian nationalists took Japanese promises at face value and agreed to cooperate with their new masters. But as the exploitative nature of Japanese occupation policies became clear, sentiment turned against the new order. Japanese officials sometimes unwittingly provoked such attitudes by their arrogance and contempt for local customs. The rape of Nanjing in 1937. Like German soldiers in occupied Europe, Japanese military forces often had little respect for the lives of their subject peoples. In their conquest of Nanjing, China in 1937, Japanese soldiers had devoted several days to killing, raping, and looting. Almost 800,000 Koreans were sent overseas, most of them as forced laborers to Japan. Comfort women. Tens of thousands of women from Korea and the Philippines were forced to be, quote, comfort women or prostitutes for Japanese troops. Forced labor. The Japanese also made extensive use of both prisoners of war and local peoples as laborers on construction projects for the war effort. The Burma-Thailand Railroad. In building the Burma-Thailand Railroad in 1943, for example, The Japanese used 61,000 Australian, British, and Dutch prisoners of war, and almost 300,000 workers from Burma, Malaya, Thailand, and the Dutch East Indies. By the time the railway was completed, 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and 90,000 local workers had died from the inadequate diet and appalling work conditions in an unhealthy climate. This is General Tadamichi Kurobashi as he prepares for the U.S. invasion of Iwo Jima. The home front. World War II was even more of a total war than World War I. Fighting was much more widespread and covered most of the world. The number of civilians killed was also far higher. Mobilizing the people. 3 examples. The Soviet Union, with the siege of Leningrad. The initial defeats of the Soviet Union led to drastic emergency mobilization measures that affected the civilian population. Leningrad, for example, experienced 900 days of siege, during which its inhabitants became so desperate for food that they ate dogs, cats, and mice. The evacuation of industry. As the German army made its rapid advance into Soviet territory, the factories in the western part of the Soviet Union were dismantled and shipped to the interior, to the Urals, western Siberia, and the Volga region. Machines were sent down on the bare earth and walls went up around them as workers began their work. The Battle of Machines. Stalin called the widespread military and industrial mobilization of the nation a, quote, battle of machines, and the Soviets won, producing 78,000 tanks and 98,000 artillery pieces. In 1943, fully 55% of social national income went for war material, compared to 15% in 1940. Women at work and in combat. Soviet women played a major role in the war effort. Women and girls were enlisted for work in industries, mines, and railroads. Overall, the number of women working in industry increased almost 60%. Soviet women were also expected to dig anti-tank ditches and work as air raid wardens. In addition, the Soviet Union was the only country in World War II to use women as combatants. Soviet women functioned as snipers and as crews in bomber squadrons. Mobilizing the people. 3 examples continued. Germany. Fear of domestic discontent. In August of 1914, Germans had enthusiastically cheered their soldiers marching off to war. In September 1939, the streets were quiet. Many Germans were apathetic, or even worse for the Nazi regime, had a foreboding of disaster. Hitler was very aware of the importance of the home front. He believed that the collapse of the home front in World War I had caused Germany's defeat. To avoid a repetition of that experience, he adopted economic policies that may indeed have cost Germany the war. Delay in implementing total war. To maintain the morale of the home front during the first 2 years of the war, Hitler refused to cut production of consumer goods or increase the production of armaments. After German defeats on the Russian front and the American entry into the war, however, the situation changed. Early in 1942, Hitler ordered a massive increase in armaments production and the size of the army. Albert Speer, as Minister of Munitions in 1942, Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, made a minister for armaments and munitions in 1942. By eliminating waste and rationalizing procedures, Speer was able to triple the production of armaments between 1942 and 1943, despite the intense Allied air raids. Speer's urgent plea for total mobilization of resources for the war effort went unheeded, however. Hitler, fearful of civilian morale problems that would undermine the home front, refused any dramatic cuts in the production of consumer goods. No total mobilization of the economy until 1944. A total mobilization of the economy was not implemented until 1944, but by that time it was too late. Changing attitudes toward women. The war caused a reversal in Nazi attitudes toward women. Nazi resistance to female employment declined as the war progressed, and more men were called up for military service. Nazi magazines now proclaimed, quote, "We see the woman as the eternal mother of our people, but also the working and fighting comrade of the man." But the number of women working in industry, agriculture, and commerce and domestic service increased only slightly. In September of 1944, 14.9 million women were employed, compared with 14.6 million in May of 1939. Many women, especially those of the middle class, resisted regular employment, particularly in factories. Japan, a highly mobilized society. Wartime Japan was a highly mobilized society. To guarantee its control over all natural resources, the government set up a planning board to control prices, wages, the utilization of labor, and the allocation of resources. Traditional habits of obedience and hierarchy, buttressed by the concept of imperial divinity, were emphasized to encourage citizens to sacrifice their resources, and sometimes their lives, for the national cause. Kamikaze Pilots. The system culminated in the final years of the war when young Japanese were encouraged to volunteer en masse to serve as pilots in the suicide missions known as Kamikaze, or Divine Wind, against U.S. battleships. Resistance to female labor. Women's rights, too, were to be sacrificed to the greater national cause. Already by 1937, Japanese women were being exhorted to fulfill their patriotic duty by bearing more children and by espousing the slogans of the Greater Japanese Women's Association. Japan was extremely reluctant to mobilize women on behalf of the war effort, however. General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister from 1941 to 1944, opposed female employment, arguing that, quote, "The weakening of the family system would be the weakening of the nation. We are able to do our duties only because we have wives and mothers at home." Female employment increased during the war, but only in areas where women traditionally worked, such as the textile industry and farming. Instead of using women to meet labor shortages, the Japanese government brought in Korean and Chinese laborers. Frontline civilians, the bombing of cities. Germans failed to break British morale. Bombing was used in World War II against non-human military targets, against enemy troops, and against civilian populations. The bombing of civilians made World War II as devastating for non-combatants as it was for frontline soldiers. A small number of bombing raids in the last year of World War I had given rise to the argument that the public outcry over the bombing of civilian populations would be an effective way to coerce governments into making peace. Consequently, European air forces began to develop long-range bombers in the 1930s. The first sustained use of civilian bombing failed to support the theory. Beginning in early September of 1940, the German Luftwaffe subjected London and many other British cities and towns to nightly air raids, making the Blitz, as the British called the German air raids, a national experience. Londoners took the first heavy blows, but kept up their morale, setting the standard for the rest of the British population. The British failed to break German morale. The firebombing of Dresden in 1945. The British failed to learn from their own experience, however. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his advisors believed that destroying German communities would break civilian morale and bring victory. Major bombing raids began in 1942. On May 31st of 1942, Cologne became the first German city to be subjected to an air attack by thousands of bombers. Bombing raids added an element of terror to circumstances already made difficult by growing shortages of food, clothing, and fuel. Germans especially feared incendiary bombs, which ignited firestorms that swept destructive paths through the cities. The ferocious bombing of Dresden from February 13th to 15th in 1945 created a firestorm that may have killed as many as 35,000 inhabitants and refugees. Little effect on war production. Germany suffered enormously from the Allied bombing raids. Millions of buildings were destroyed, and possibly 500,000 civilians died from these raids. Nevertheless, it is highly unlikely that Allied bombing sapped the morale of the German people. Instead, Germans, whether pro-Nazi or anti-Nazi, fought on stubbornly, often driven simply by a desire to live. Nor did the bombing destroy Germany's industrial capacity. The Allied Strategic Bombing Survey revealed that the production of war material actually increased between 1942 and 1944. The first atomic bombs on Japan. In Japan, the bombing of civilians reached a horrendous new level with the use of the first atomic bomb. Attacks on Japanese cities by the new American B-29 superfortress, the biggest bombers of the war, had begun on November 24th of 1944. By summer of 1945, many of Japan's industries had been destroyed, along with 1/4 of its dwellings. After the Japanese government decreed the mobilization of all peoples between the ages of 13 and 60 into the so-called People's Volunteer Corps, President Truman and his advisors decided that Japanese fanaticism might mean 1 million American casualties, and Truman decided to drop the newly developed atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was incredible. Of 76,000 buildings near the hypocenter of the explosion in Hiroshima, 70,000 were flattened, and 140,000 of the city's 400,000 inhabitants had died by the end of 1945. Over the next 5 years, another 50,000 perished from the effects of the radiation. The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945 announced the dawn of the nuclear age. The path to modernization. One aspect of the Soviet effort to create an advanced industrial society was the collectivization of agriculture, which included the rapid mechanization of food production. In this photograph, peasants are watching a new tractor at work. The bombing of civilians, East and West. World War II was the most destructive war in world history, not only for frontline soldiers, but for civilians at home as well. The most devastating bombing of civilians came near the end of World War II, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the left is a view of Hiroshima after the bombing that shows the incredible devastation produced by the atomic bomb. This next picture shows a street in Clydebank near Glasgow in Scotland, the day after the city was bombed by the Germans in March of 1940. Only 7 of the city's 12,000 houses were left undamaged. 35,000 of the 47,000 inhabitants became homeless overnight. The aftermath of the war. World War II was the most destructive war in history. Much had been at stake. Nazi Germany followed a worldview based on racial extermination and the enslavement of millions in order to create an Aryan racial empire. The Japanese, fueled by extreme nationalist ideas, also pursued dreams of empire in Asia that led to mass murder of untold devastation. Fighting the Axis powers in World War II required the mobilization of millions of ordinary men and women in Allied countries who struggled to preserve a different way of life. As Winston Churchill once put it, war is horrible, but slavery is worse. The cost of World War II. The costs of World War II were enormous. At least 21 million soldiers died. Civilian deaths were even greater and are now estimated at around 40 million, of whom more than 28 million were Russian and Japanese. The Soviet Union experienced the greatest losses: 10 million soldiers, 19 million civilians. In 1945, millions of people around the world faced starvation in Europe. In Europe alone, 100 million people depended on food relief of some kind. Tens of millions of, quote, displaced persons. Millions of people had also been uprooted by the war and become displaced persons. Europe alone may have had 30 million displaced persons, many of whom found it hard to return home. In Asia, millions of Japanese were returned from the former Japanese Empire to Japan, while thousands of Korean forced laborers returned to Korea. Devastation was everywhere. Most areas in Europe had been damaged or demolished. China was in shambles after 8 years of conflict. The Philippines had suffered heavy damage, and large sections of the major cities in Japan had been destroyed in air raids. The total monetary cost of the war had been estimated at $4 trillion. The economies of most belligerents, with the exception of the United States, were left drained and on the brink of disaster. World War II and the European colonies, decolonization. Colonial powers exhausted by war. As we saw in the previous chapter, movements for independence had begun in earnest in Africa and Asia in the years between World War I and World War II. After World War II, these movements grew even louder. The ongoing subjugation of peoples by colonial powers seemed at odds with the goals the Allies had pursued in overthrowing the repressive regimes of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Then, too, indigenous peoples everywhere took up the call for national self-determination and expressed their determination to fight for independence. The ending of the European powers, colonial empires, did not come easy, however. In 1941, Churchill had said, quote, "I have not become His Majesty's chief minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." Britain and France in particular seemed reluctant to let go of their colonies, but for a variety of reasons, both eventually gave in the obvious. The days of empire were over. During the war, the Japanese had already humiliated the Western states by overrunning their colonial empires. In addition, colonial soldiers, who had fought on behalf of the Allies, India, for example, had contributed large numbers of troops to the British Indian Army, were well aware that Allied war aims included the principle of self-determination for the peoples of the world. Equally important to the process of decolonization, the power of the European states had been destroyed by the exhaustive struggles of World War II. The greatest empire builder, Great Britain, no longer had the energy or the wealth to maintain its empire. Given this combination of circumstances, a rush of decolonization swept the world after the war. The Allied War Conferences. The total victories of the Allies in World War II was not followed by a real peace, but by the emergence of a new conflict known as the Cold War, which dominated world politics until the end of the 1980s. The Cold War grew out of military, political, and ideological differences, especially between the Soviet Union and the United States, that became apparent at the Allied War Conferences held in the last years of the war. Tehran, in November of 1943. The partition of Germany. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, the leaders of the Big Three of the Grand Alliance, met at Tehran, the capital of Iran, in 1943 in November to decide the future course of the war. Stalin and Roosevelt argued successfully for an American-British invasion of the continent through France, which they scheduled for the spring of 1944. This meant that Soviet and British-American air forces would meet in defeated Germany along a north-south dividing line that the Soviet forces would most likely liberate Eastern Europe. The Allies also agreed to a partition of post-war Germany. Yalta, in February of 1945. Free elections and the United Nations. By the time of the conference at Yalta in southern Russia in February of 1945, the defeat of Germany was a foregone conclusion. The Western powers now faced the reality of 11 million Red Army soldiers taking possession of Eastern and Central Europe. Stalin, deeply suspicious of the Western powers, desired a buffer to protect the Soviet Union from possible future Western aggression. At the same time, however, Stalin was eager to obtain economically important resources and strategic military positions. Roosevelt, by this time, was moving toward the idea of self-determination for Europe. The Grand Alliance approved a declaration on liberated Europe. This was a pledge to assist liberated European nations in the creation of democratic institutions of their own choice. Liberated countries were to hold free elections to determine their political systems. At Yalta, Roosevelt sought Russian military help against Japan. The atomic bomb was not yet assured, and American military planners feared the possibility of heavy losses in amphibious assaults on the Japanese home islands. Roosevelt therefore agreed to Stalin's price for military assistance against Japan, possession of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, as well as 2 warm water ports and railroad rights in Manchuria. The creation of the United Nations was a major American concern at Yalta. Roosevelt hoped to ensure the partition of the big 3 powers in a post-war international organization before difficult issues divided them into hostile camps. After a number of compromises, both Churchill and Stalin accepted Roosevelt's plan for a United Nations organization and set the first meeting for San Francisco in April of 1945. Occupation zones and Poland. The issue of Germany and Eastern Europe was treated less decisively. The Big Three reaffirmed that Germany must surrender unconditionally and created 4 occupation zones. A compromise was also worked out in regard to Poland. Stalin agreed to free elections in the future to determine a new government, but the issue of free elections in Eastern Europe caused a serious rift between the Soviets and the Americans. In principle, Eastern European governments were to be freely elected, but they were also supposed to be pro-Soviet. This attempt to reconcile 2 irreconcilable goals was doomed to failure, and soon became evident at the next conference of the Big Three, Potsdam, in July of 1945. The Potsdam Conference of July of 1945 began under a cloud of mistrust. Roosevelt had died on April 12th and had been succeeded as president by Harry Truman. At Potsdam, Truman decided free elections throughout Eastern Europe. Stalin responded, quote, "A freely elected government in any of these East European countries would be anti-Soviet, and that we cannot allow." After a bitterly fought and devastating war, Stalin sought absolute military security. To him, it could be gained only by the presence of communist states in Eastern Europe. Free elections might result in governments hostile to the Soviets. By the middle of 1945, only an invasion by Western forces could undo developments in Eastern Europe, and few people favored such a policy. An Iron Curtain in March of 1946. As the war slowly receded into the past, the reality of conflicting ideologies had reappeared. Many in the West interpreted Soviet policy as part of a worldwide communist conspiracy. The Soviets viewed Western, especially American policy, as nothing less than global capitalist expansionism, or in Leninist terms, economic imperialism. In March of 1946, in a speech to an American audience, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that, quote, "an iron curtain had, quote, descended across the continent, dividing Germany and Europe now into 2 hostile camps." Stalin branded Churchill's speech a, quote, "call to war with the Soviet Union." Only months after the world's most devastating conflict had ended, the world once again seemed to be bitterly divided in the Cold War. bombing of civilians, East and West. World War II was the most destructive war in history, not only for frontline soldiers, but for civilians at home. The most devastating bombing of civilians came near the end of World War II when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first picture here is the bombing of Hiroshima. That shows the incredible devastation produced by the atomic bomb. This map shows territorial changes in Europe after World War II. In the last months of World War II, the Red Army occupied much of Eastern Europe. Stalin sought pro-Soviet satellite states in the region as a buffer against future invasions from Western Europe, whereas Britain and the United States wanted democratically elected governments. Soviet military control of the territory settled the question.